Welcome to the Cartoonist Kayfabe courtroom. My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
And we are continuing the Todd McFarlane deposition coverage. This is in accordance to the Neil Gaiman deposition that we did to kind of start off this brand of episodes. That was just incredibly fascinating pieces of testimony from people who are sworn in, where they have to be truthful, give as much fact of the matter as possible, and you get some interesting insights.
And they've got to explain comics
Yes.
to a bunch of legal people that have no idea how this zany business works. Yeah. I think we went down this rabbit hole because of you just start reading these and realize like these are kind of like first-rate interviews with these creators. So
yeah, for sure.
From a little skewed perspective.
We have a link to the first part of the Todd McFarlane deposition directly below this video. And you learn some stuff. Like, I didn't really think about or know that there's a page rate. And as you go along, you get a couple more dollars or something like that. But it's the royalties that separate the men from the boys and give you the reason to try to excel and make better comics. And you know, that it feels weird to think about, like, if the guy who draws Avengers gets paid the same as the guy who draws Quasar or something, in as much as pencil mileage.
Right.
You know, the amount of stuff you got to draw per page, feels unfair.
Yeah, and I'd say if you are starting here, part one is basically the history of Todd McFarlane's career.
Yes.
So that's kind of cool to see him, talk about going through DC, going through submissions, DC, Marvel, Spider-Man, all that backstory of how he got to Spawn, essentially. So pretty fun to hear in his words, his career. And I am always impressed by the Image guys in that, like, most of them are 5 or 6 years in.
Yeah.
Like, they do it pretty quick. McFarlane, a couple years at DC, a couple years at Marvel, and we're at Spider-Man.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Let's give shouts to Dan Best for corralling all of this testimony for us to enjoy.
Yes.
With this podcast, videocast, YouTube show. And the way that we play the game, Jimmy is going to be the voice of everybody who's not Todd McFarlane. This is for sometimes the judge, the defense attorney, Todd McFarlane's attorney. You'll hear some back and forth that way. And I'll be Todd. Fair?
Yes.
If you're good, I'm good, Jimmy. We come back from a short recess.
Mr. Arnson, did Neil provide some, what I guess are called thumbnail sketches, to you for Spawn 9?
With the script, yes.
So he sent those to you when he sent the script to you?
Right.
Is that a typical part of the process?
No.
Were there any discussions beforehand, before him providing these to you, of him providing the thumbnail sketches?
Uh-oh, Jimmy. Here we go. Just, again, Neil had a way of working, and I didn't want to disrupt that, so, however you work, I'll adjust around it.
Did you use the thumbnail sketches at all?
I looked at them for some of the pacing that he wanted, but again, not. So it would be bad against writers, but they are not artists, so you have to make adjustments where you see fit, so...
Backing up a minute on this comic book process and the final piece of original artwork that becomes the copy for the publication, what does that look like? How big is it? What does it look like?
Generally, the image is 10 by 15 inches, and it's black and white because the inker has now come on and made it. The color is done at the printer or now on computer, so the color rarely is there. It's black and white imagery of what you would see in a comic book at a larger size.
So it's a page?
Yes, a page. Each page would be 10 by 15.
Okay, then what use is made of those pages once the comic book comes out? Do they have some value as original artwork, like you see these Disney things and stuff like that?
Yes, traditionally the way it works and the way that's been explained to me is that we don't own, for instance, when I'm working on Spider-Man, I don't own Spider-Man, but I own the paper that it's on. The image that it's on. So although you can't now separate the image from the paper, what they do is historically they give you the original artwork back, and you could do with it as you want as long as you're not doing reproductions of it. And so again, historically, most artists would take them to conventions, sell them, give them away, give them to family members, whatever they want to do. Hang them up, whatever they choose.
And is that what you did with your Spawn artwork also?
No.
What did you do with that?
Kept it.
You still have all of it?
Yes.
What about your Spider-Man artwork?
No, I sold some of those pages, the good ones.
In your initial discussions with the 4 guest writers who were doing, I believe it's Spawn 8 through 11, did you tell them up front it's $100,000?
Uh-huh.
You have to use words.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
You were testifying earlier concerning your conversation with Neil concerning his DC agreement. Do you recall that?
Right.
Did you do anything to look into what his DC agreement was?
Once he mentioned that he wanted the same rights and privileges of it, then I go, well, you're going to have to tell me what those are, you know? So, better yet, you know, if you want to give me a copy, cool. But he just handed over some of the terms, whatever that was a specific item we happened to be talking about.
Did you refer back to the contract that you had with DC?
Not at the beginning.
At some point in time?
Yes.
Mr. Arnson. Mike, did you produce those? Mr. Kahn. No, I don't. I don't remember seeing them, but let me ask you, can you put your hands on that contract?
I can look for it. Again, we're going back to 85, so it's probably in a weird spot if I still have it.
Mr. Kahn. Well, if we can find it, we will produce it, and if you stumble on it tonight, we'll give it to you tomorrow.
All right.
Mr. Arnson. Okay, did you ever do anything back in this 1992 period? Did you do anything else to try to determine, okay, what are the terms of the DC agreement that Neil is talking about?
No. For the most part, Neil fed me most of the information.
Did, in fact, the compensation that each of the guest writers for Spawn 8 through 11 receive, was it $100,000 apiece?
I believe so.
Any other compensation?
I know there were additional payments, I'm trying to think. For those issues, no.
How about for reprints of those issues?
There were additional payments made after the publication of it to Neil, but again, I don't know specifically what each one of those was for.
How about the other artists, the other authors? For instance, I note the issues were reprinted in trade paperbacks, correct?
Right.
And were the writers paid something for that?
I don't think so, or I don't know.
Your answer is you don't know?
I don't know.
Did you have any discussions in this 1992 period with any of these guest writers about the copyrights for the work?
Not specifically in those terms, no.
And when you're saying not specifically in those terms, do you ever recall the word copyright being mentioned?
No.
The same with trademark?
Well, I owned the trademark for Spawn, so everybody sort of knew it was my book. They knew they were coming to my book, so they knew who owned that.
With regard to the Spawn trademark?
Right.
Have there been other guest authors for Spawn since these Spawn 8 through 11 guest authors?
There have been other people write the books.
Was this on a work-for-hire basis?
I don't know how we broke down everybody.
These 4 guest authors weren't on a work-for-hire basis, correct?
I can't say that. It wasn't in writing, and we all sort of understood what the task was in front of us.
What do you mean by that?
I created a book, Spawn. I wanted them to come onto my book and do some writing for my book. So although we weren't lawyers, we didn't get into it. I think it was a general understanding as to what everybody was getting into.
Was the phrase work for hire mentioned?
I don't recall.
Did any of the other 3 guest authors for Spawn 8 through 11 create any new characters?
Yes.
And who created what?
I don't know. I don't know if they actually gave them names or It's impossible to write something and not create something new. So I'd have to look at those issues before I could give you that answer.
Did any of the other guest authors create any characters of whom action figures were made?
No.
Was Spawn issue 9 successful?
I'd say yes.
What was its, putting it in the spectrum of of the Spawn comics, was it more successful than most, less successful, within the middle, that kind of thing?
I believe that when Spawn 1 came out, it was number 1, and it continued to be issue number 1. So in the confines that issue 9 was, I believe, still issue number 1. Then it was equal to task, if you will. So, if you will. And I think 8, 9, 10, and 11 were all issue number 1. Spawn was the number 1 selling book.
So you're saying each succeeding issue outsold the preceding one?
No. He's saying it like, You don't understand. I don't understand, Todd. God damn it, I'm reading your words.
And I used to read the top 100 list every month.
I'm saying we have charts in our industry, and regardless of sales, because that's all relevant, that they say who is the biggest seller. So to be sort of overly simplistic, you could sell 1 million and be in first. You could also sell 3, and if everybody else sold 2, you'd still only be number 1. So taking out sales, sort of within the confines of it, sales, I believe, was Nonstop 1 for almost 20 issues in a row.
So you're saying that, if I understand correctly, as best you can recall, Spawns 1 through 20 were each the biggest selling comic book for their month of issue. Is that correct?
Or for a regular book, or pretty damn close, right?
Okay. And was Spawn issue number 9, within the context of the first 20 Spawn issues, where did it come out? In other words, were they all approximately equally successful? Did it outsell the ones before and after? I'm just trying to get a context.
Probably it would be mid-range if you average the first 20, because by issue 20, the market's starting to soften a bit, so you're still behind the charts, and not be selling near. Hold up. Probably it would be mid-range if you average the first 20, because by issue 20, the market's starting to soften a bit, so you're still behind the charts and not be selling near what you were selling at the beginning.
What was the biggest selling Spawn issue?
Spawn number 1.
Did you have any discussions then following the issuance of Spawn number 9 of Neil doing some other work following up on the work he'd done for Spawn 9?
I think shortly after issue 9 came out, we both sort of seemed to be happy with what had gone down, and Neil wanted to do some more work. So we sort of talked about some other projects, and the obvious one for him was to do a miniseries, which isn't a regular book, with Angela in it.
And what's a miniseries?
A miniseries is not unlike what you see on TV. That it's not part of regular programming, so again, Spawn is a monthly comic book, and so is Superman and Batman and those kinds of books. But every now and then, companies will add, or creators or publishers will add sort of standalone stories, but they don't mean it to be an ongoing book. They just have a story to tell. Sometimes it's 1 issue, sometimes it's 10, and in between that. But it's not meant to be something that will last much longer than a short period of time.
So you had discussions about Neil doing something like this with regard to Angela?
Yes, we talked about doing more work together.
Tell me how that came about, what you recall about that.
Like I said, I think it was issue 9 came out. We were both happy with sort of the results. And so again, he wanted to do some more work. I was happy with what he had done and said, and he said, let me do some more Angela. Okay, do you want to write a miniseries? That's good.
What did you talk about with regard to the contractual provisions of that?
Again, I think it fell into the same sort of discussion we'd had. Again, get it within my DC contract, and I don't even know if we got that specific. We were just happy that we had a success of 1 book. Let's go and do some more books together.
So did you talk about money at all for it?
I think we discussed, again, being able to give him a bit of an advance before he started writing the issues, and then there may have been some parameters of, a minimum amount that he could sort of count on, that he wouldn't get any less than something, so that he knew at the end of the day he'd have X amount of dollars in his pocket.
Did you talk about percentages at all?
I don't recall. We may have.
And was the process for the writing of the Angela miniseries the same as the process for Spawn 9?
I don't think so.
How was it different?
My recollection is that Neil did a full script on issue 9, and when the Angela miniseries started, I wasn't the artist on that book. A fellow by the name of Greg Capullo was. And I told Neil, I was working with Greg at the time, I told Neil how I worked with Greg, which was to give him an outline and let him do the artwork and come back. Marvel method style, essentially. So I think somewhere along in the process of the Angela miniseries, 1 or more of those issues got converted into that style of somehow getting the information to Greg and letting Greg do the artwork and then writing it later. So I don't know if all 3 were done that way or if it was a mix and match, but I think there was a conversation there.
Did you ever apply for a copyright on the Spawn issue 9 script, Mr. Kahn? Do you mean the script and nothing else, Mr. Arnson? I mean the script.
The script as a separate thing, ?
Yes.
I don't think so.
Did you ever have any discussions with Neil concerning intellectual property rights or respective creative rights with regard to the Angela miniseries?
Only as they related to his DC contract.
And have you fully told us your recollection of that?
Uh-huh.
You have to use words, Mr. Kahn. You have to answer with words.
Yes.
Mr. Arnston. When did you first come up with selling Angela toys?
Is the question, when did we first sell the Angela toy?
Yes.
Maybe early 94, 95, 93. I'm not early to mid-90s.
Did you have any discussions with Neil as to whether he was entitled to a share of the royalties for the Angela toys?
Nothing I recall specifically.
Anything you recall generally?
Just again, I thought I'd get paid money when I do stuff like this for DC. Okay, just so how much is that? Send it over.
Did you have any discussions with Neil concerning whether he was entitled to any payment for the reprints of Spawn issue 9?
Again, I don't know if we talked about it specifically.
Was Neil paid?
I don't know.
And the Angela miniseries was reprinted into a trade paperback, correct?
Right.
Did you have any discussions with Neil as to if he'd be paid anything for that?
Again, just as it related to how he was used to getting paid on those kinds of books.
From DC?
Right.
And you were in agreement with that?
Well, again, I go, well, what is it? Let me see the contract. Let me see it, or give me the information. So he'd give me some numbers sometimes.
Did you do anything else to, again, verify the information?
Well, I kept prodding Neil, kept asking questions to Neil, kept trying to sort of get the information. I all the time asked if I could actually see this elusive contract, and then much later, made some phone calls to sort of verify some of the information.
Are you talking about in 1997?
I'm talking from 1993 onward.
With regard to phone calls you made to verify the information?
To the initial statement of, quote, I need this to sort of match my DC contract, end quote. From there, the race begins.
What? The what?
The race began from there.
Okay, and what did you do? Tell me about the race.
Cartoonist Kayfabe is brought to you by the comic books that Jimmy and I make, coming out in March, early March. Red Room Trigger Warnings, issue number 1 is going to hit the stands. There was a ransomware attack at the Diamond distribution offices, which prevented a lot of stores from getting their final orders in before the due date. What I'm saying is this comic is going to be a little more scarce than the rest, and I need it to sell out immediately. I think that would be a good show of the Kayfabe audience. These are some of the retail incentive variant covers to go along with that issue. Right now, at this very moment, you could grab Red Room, the Antisocial Network trade paperback that collects the 2021 season of Red Room Comics. Rising Tide Raises All Ships. Some other stuff in the back catalog that is still on the stands and easily available through your local comic shop if it's a good one, and Amazon if your shop isn't. WYSIWYG, Portrait of a Serial Hacker, is the life story of a computer hacker from the birth of high technology through the phone system up to WikiLeaks, essentially, man. 288-page graphic novel. I sort of made my initial name on the Hip Hop Family Tree comics. 4 volumes of that are finally back in print after Kayfabe coming out and selling out a whole bunch of comics at comic shops and Amazon, but these are back in print as a box set and as individual issues. And X-Men Grand Design, man, my 3-volume set of Treasury editions is still out there on the stands. They keep it readily available in print, and there is an omnibus version of that where I take 300 issues of X-Men comics, try to tell a complete, cohesive story using all of that material. Get these comics at your local comic shop. Support Cartoonist Kayfabe that way. King Kayfaber Jim Rugg has his Grand Design comic coming out at this moment. Jimmy, let's clear a little space. Can you grab these guys off? Hulk Grand Design, Monster and Madness, coming out in March and April, where Jimmy's taking 40, 50 years worth of Incredible Hulk comics, probably 10,000 pages worth of material, distilling it down into an 80-page essential narrative that you're going to have to get your hands on. And it's the 60th anniversary of the Hulk, man. What better way to get in and enjoy one of Marvel's sort of crown jewel achievements in their catalog. These are the variant covers to go along with Hulk Grand Design. The Eddie P variant, Peach Momoko, Marcos Martin, and Uncle Jeff Darrow does a variant cover for the second issue or the Madness issue of Hulk Grand Design. And these are the books of Jim's that are in print at this very moment that we need you guys to goose the numbers on those Amazon ranking charts for. Street Angel Deadliest Girl Alive collects all of Jimmy's albums that were published by Image Comics, plus a lot of material that ended up in editions of like 50, 100. You know, these seasonal specials, Halloween special, Christmas special. You got to read those comics, man. Some of Jimmy's darkest stuff, especially that Christmas one. And Plain Janes with Cecil Castellucci. Look at the page count of this, man. It is a shoujo manga of a bunch of teenage girl artists who sort of Banksy up and Shepard Ferry this town, get in all kinds of adventures, all kinds of trouble. Jimmy, I swear you draw me on one of these pages early on, man. I see a little gap tooth, dude, when I was just wearing those white t-shirts every day. Multicolored, heck of a project. Took at least 10, 15 years to draw this thing over time, man, and worthy of anybody's bookshelf. But now that we finished paying the bills, let's get back to the video. Again, from the very beginning, you see, Todd's getting frustrated. Again, from the very beginning, okay? Quote, I don't want to be any worse off than the DC contract. I need to match that contract, end quote. Quote, okay, what is it? What am I matching? What am I matching? End quote. And then every now and then, he'd sort of go, quote, well, here's some numbers, some payments if you happen to do a t-shirt, or you happen to do a toy, or if you happen to do a reprint or something, end quote. And then I'd get that information, okay, ask some follow-up questions about it. I think there was some initial payments made upon some of that information, and then as the process went on, I started sort of seeing inconsistencies, so I asked sort of more questions, and as more questions sort of were asked, those consistencies became a bit of a problem.
What inconsistencies?
A number of inconsistencies. The inconsistencies of the numbers or the calculations and how we got there and what it was all relevant to and what the definitions were. Everything that comes from a normal contract.
Can you give me some examples?
Payments for, say, paperbacks. Payments for a toy. Payments for a character, whether they are in their own book or not. I mean, it's sort of a wide spectrum.
What inconsistency do you recall with regard to payments for a trade paperback?
I don't know specifically right now. I'm sure you're going to show me documents. We can point them out if you'd like later on.
But do you have any? It sounds to me like you're referring to inconsistencies in conversations, and I'm trying to see what you recall from conversations.
Right. Well, in conversations, Neil was giving a number that he would get X amount of money for a DC job, and then later on, I'd get through it, didn't sound right to me. Now, given that I had worked at DC, so I'd go, well, just sort of to be clear here, Angela, there's two of us created the character, so does that number get divided into? Oh yes, my mistake. Yes, you're right. That number does get divided. Oops.
When was that conversation?
Those conversations, unfortunately, were pretty much ongoing from about late 93 on.
The conversation with regard to Angela being divided in two?
No, those conversations in general.
Okay, but what I'm trying to do is focus on...
I don't remember the specific conversation that I'm speaking about. Is this like the watershed moment that you see in courtroom dramas?
Yes, this is somewhere like Jack Nicholson should be slapping the table.
You need somebody like me.
Do you remember any specific conversations in this regard?
Just asking him again, what are the numbers? Is there any chance we are ever going to see these contracts? You know, taking him for his word, making the payments, seeing the inconsistency later, asking some questions, and then just sort of going, I've got a bit of a moving target here. It's tough for me to sort of nail what it is I'm supposed to be matching when it seems to be moving. It's elusive to me.
And again, in what specific context did these come up?
Conversations over the phone for the most part.
Okay, but with regard to what types of rights? For instance, did you have such conversations concerning trade paperbacks?
Right, the paperbacks.
All right, and what did Neil say he got paid from DC, say, with regard to the Angela paperback?
I don't recall the number. I would have asked him, quote, how do you get paid, end quote. And then he would either have given it to me verbally or sent something to me.
Okay, and did something come to you that caused you to question the veracity of that information?
For Angela? Not really.
Okay, not for Angela. For what?
For Medieval Spawn and Cog.
All right. Tell me about the conversations with Medieval Spawn that caused you to question the veracity of what Neil told you.
Medieval Spawn is what I would define as a derivative character of something that pre-existed. So there was a Spawn, there's a mytho, there was sort of a history there, and then you do a slight variation on the ongoing thing that pre-existed. According to Neil, no matter how slight that is, he is entitled to an accounting price, if you will, to derivative characters. It didn't seem right to me, but again, I was taking Neil at his word at the time.
And so I guess what I'd like is, as best you can recall the conversation you were referring to concerning Neil's position with regard to what he was entitled to for Medieval Spawn. I want an English major to diagram that sentence.
Yes.
Good Lord.
Yes. Lots of this stuff, man. There's a lot of start and stop mid-sentence, kind of like...
I'm going to read it one more time for everybody at home.
Yes.
And so I guess what I'd like is, as best you can recall the conversation you are referring to concerning Neil's position with regard to what he was entitled to for Medieval Spawn.
This sounds like that In Living Color skit. The pyretic viscosity is directly proportional to the beat of the meat, you understand?
That's exactly what this is.
Where are we? It was more than he was entitled to any ownership.
Okay.
Any of it. It was awkward that he would have any stake. And I'm saying accounting ownership, not to actual accounting ownership in DC comic books for doing a derivative of an existing character. He assured me that he was indeed correct and then supplied numbers to me, either written or verbally, and again subsequent payments were made based upon that information.
Okay, what did he tell you? What numbers did he supply?
I don't recall the specific numbers. I was more transfixed on that there would be any numbers attached to a derivative character.
So it was your view that it was your thought that he wasn't entitled to anything from Medieval Spawn. Is that correct?
Well, I was surprised that his answer was, quote, with my DC contract, yes, indeed, end quote. That's true again, that I had told him I'd match the contract. I go, okay. You know, I don't have to like it, but okay.
All right. Based on your experience with DC Comics, had you had any insights as to how DC treated rights to derivative characters?
Infinity Incorporated, the book I did, was essentially made up of the sons and daughters of existing superheroes, and so some of those used the same names and costume designs and things like that. And I was never entitled to anything.
Of course, but that was on a work-for-hire basis, correct?
Correct.
You never told Neil that, in your view, his work in connection with, writing for Image was on a work-for-hire basis, correct?
Only in the confines of his DC contract.
What do you mean by that?
That he goes, quote, match my DC contract, end quote. So I assumed all of these years DC is a work-for-hire contract. So given that that's what he continued to point at, then we can all sort of assume that all those rights are sort of transferred now into his new job.
And did you have any specific discussions with Neil in that regard?
Again, only in, quote, I want you to match the terms of the DC contract, end quote.
With regard to the other three guest writers in Spawn 8 through 11, did you ever have any conversations with them concerning whether their work for you was on a work-for-hire basis?
Not specifically.
Generally?
No, I don't recall.
Okay, do you recall anything in that regard?
No.
Did you have any discussions in connection with the Cogliostro character as to what Neil's rights would be under his DC contract?
Cogliostro? Neil would supply me with numbers, but he and Cogliostro was always a bit of a bone of contention.
Why was that?
Because Neil thought we co-created it, and I was more of the mind that I gave it to him, given that he was very sensitive when he was going to write the script and what I wanted in it, what I would like to see in it, if there was anything I wanted to add, if it had any characters coming through or anything. We just, so I told him about this Moses character I was going to bring in here. He said, "Oh, I hope you bring it in there." So I didn't consider that to be the same creative process that's something like Angela.
But did you view that Neil had been part of the creative process for Cogliostro?
Well, maybe in a slight way, because I ignored that he actually wrote thereafter and essentially reinvented the guy afterwards. So,
how did you reinvent the guy?
I thought he was a little too corny, a little blasé-faire. A little sort of kooky. Do you think they meant kooky?
Kooky.
No K there in this one. He's a little bit of a drunk bum who knew something, where Cog, the anti-Moses, is a father figure. Should be sort of like a Harvard graduate. He shouldn't be a buffoon to some extent. He should actually be a guy who's actually like a professor that can actually correct you at any given point and sort of use big words and sort of be like an overseer of all the stories. And so what this character was that I wanted never matched my expectations, and so I sort of ignored it and moved on and just went in my direction.
And what was that direction sort of making him smarter? It sounds like what you're saying.
Holy fuck. Changing his costume, changing when he doesn't appear, his mannerisms, the way he talks, the way he speaks, what his agenda is, where he comes from, his whole back history, how he relates to Spawn, how he relates to heaven and the earth and the curse and everything else. I added all of that.
So that wasn't a change so much as an addition, correct?
No, that was a change.
Okay. Describe how it was a change, how it was different from what Neil wrote.
Well, again, let's be clear that Neil wrote after having conversations with me as to how this character would speak and what he was about. So let's just get that on the record.
But what I'm talking about, Spawn issue 9 introduces a character named Cogliostro, correct?
Right.
And it's in the script for Spawn issue 9, which Neil wrote, correct?
Correct.
And then I believe you indicated that, and you used the character Cogliostro in subsequent works relating to Spawn, correct?
Correct.
And I understood what you were saying earlier, that the character that you subsequently used, you changed significantly from the Cogliostro character that appears in Spawn issue 9. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay, what were the changes?
His mannerisms, his body appearance, his physical appearance, whether he would carry animals with him or not, what he spoke of, why he spoke of it.
That sounds like Noah, not Moses.
And it also sounds like all visual and nothing written.
You know what? Little break here, conjecture. It makes me realize like how impossible it is to sort this stuff out.
Yeah, for sure.
Because there's stuff we can agree on. Todd and Neil on the phone a bunch talking about stories, what's going to go in this issue and stuff. It just gets really hard to actually say like who gets the credit for this character or that character, especially when you're assigning a, I don't know, percentage or number value as to who the creator is. And I think about it more than just Todd and Neil. It goes back to Stan and Jack for me, or
totally.
any of these people. Like, even if you were there, it seems like it would be almost impossible to really untangle this kind of thing.
Going through both of these depositions is really fun, too, because, it is Rashomon.
Yeah.
Like, we got the same thing, and we're getting two perspectives. We have a Neil Gaiman saying that he's trying his best to, continue getting in touch with Todd McFarlane. Todd's not responding, yada, yada. He's got to go through Terry Fetchrold, blah, blah, blah. And here we have Todd McFarlane saying, listen, I've been chasing these numbers from Neil Gaiman. We see Neil Gaiman stuff where he's got facsimile copies of all these contracts and things that he sent. He's sending dated letters and things like that. Is there an impenetrable wall? When you have a business, is it a good procedure to have a kind of buffer in between so that you don't see a lot of legalese, so that you have plausible deniability in a court of law, that you don't see these things. You know, I'm not saying that Todd did that, but that sounds like that could be a possibility in a business.
And it's wild, the stuff that they agree on. They both agree that they were going to honor the DC, you know, I'd be as good as DC was or better. Not disputing that.
Yeah.
But now we're disputing, like, how much did he do with this character?
Yes.
Because then I changed the character back to the way I described it to him when he was putting the issue together. You know, like, it's just really hard. You know, it's almost, who do you like?
The whole issue of derivative character is fascinating, too, because the DC contract almost solely hinges on a character called Sandman, of which DC had a character called Sandman. But this character, if that's considered a derivative character, like, there's some gymnastics being done because it's pretty much a name only.
Right.
And is that considered a derivative character? We have to go back to the tape. We have to go back to that deposition and see how that shook out.
But yeah, for the sake of defining, like, what is derivative in your DC contract,
yeah,
I don't know how you untangle any of this. Wow.
Got to make some decisions. Got to set some precedents.
It does illustrate just how murky this material really is.
Yeah.
You know, because, like, you read this, I would read this in maybe a comics journal, or probably a comics journal, you know, maybe something online, but I'd read a paragraph about a settlement. It doesn't give you any of this. You know, it makes it out like this person was right or this person won, and it's like, you know, this is how the settlement went, but it's not at all black and white.
Right.
All right. Back into it.
Yes.
And I guess, I apologize for interrupting, but I guess what I'd like is specifics. What mannerisms did he have, and how did you change them, for instance?
I see some fun things in this next answer. Instead of being sort of a bum whose concern was getting a 6-pack of Ripple wine, his concern was to be the father image, to actually bring knowledge to people, not to necessarily worry about his own personal drunkard at the stage, and to bring insight specifically to the characters around him, and more specifically to Spawn, and guide him along the path through the 120 issues I've done so far.
Did Cogliostro bring insight to Spawn in Spawn issue 9?
No. Not any in the way that I wanted. No.
Okay. And what was different about the way you wanted him to do it than it was done in Spawn issue 9?
Again, just that he seemed like a high school graduate instead of a Harvard graduate. So make your inferences from what that means.
Okay. You wanted him smarter.
Right.
What other changes did you make? And again, I'm looking at specifics rather than generalities.
I wanted him to be more, again, Moses. Moses coming down the hill with the tablets. It should be revered when you see him. It shouldn't be a drunk, if you will. Looking for the next bottle of whiskey, which is sort of what he was in issue number 9. So I was looking for grandeur, and I didn't feel like I got grandeur.
Okay, so you made him grander, correct?
Correct.
Okay, what other changes did you make?
Grandeur is a big word, so that qualifies a lot. So I'll leave it at that.
Why don't you describe the ways you made him grander, then?
I love that, dude. It seems like Monty Python or something. It's grander versus grandeur.
It really is, and I feel like we've had moments like this in every single deposition that we have read.
I wonder if that's a technique. Get somebody unorthodox, a little frazzled.
It feels like you're arguing, you know, this is letter of the law kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And again, I can kind of understand why you want something specific, because this is just, it's throw the dart at a dart, you know, it blindfold yourself and throw the dart as to who's right and wrong so far. All right. Why don't you describe the ways you made him grander then, Mr. Khan? Let me just, at least for the record, object. I think it's been asked and answered.
Yeah, I thought so.
Mr. Khan, if you look at his transcript in the last 10 minutes, Todd's efforts that he made to change the character. Mr. Arnson, that's what I'm trying to find out. I don't think we are going over the same ground. I think we are getting some detail, turning general statements into specific statements. Mr. Khan, maybe so, and the record will speak for itself. I just want to save the record. Mr. Arnson, how did you go about making him grander?
Well, I think the first change was a spelling mistake, you know? We gave scripts to writers or to letterers, and sometimes they work late and they don't pay attention, and I don't know. I think Neil might have had Cogliostro, and it got changed to... Oh, excuse me. I think Neil might have had Cagliostro, and it got changed to Cogliostro. And again, it was sort of a tongue twister, sort of a name. At some point, you get stuck with what the letterer gives you, and that was the new name, right? And then later on, we sort of changed him. We had given him a history. We had given him sort of a full name. Cogliostro is just like Madonna. There's no sort of name there. So we had to give him a sort of full identity, and I think later on, we gave him sort of a full-blown name that went with it instead of just Cogliostro.
Well, wasn't his initial name called Nicholas Cogliostro?
I don't know what his first name was.
What first name did you give him?
I don't know.
You just recall giving him a first name.
Right.
So what discussions did you have with Neil with regard to payment for Cogliostro in the context of Neil's DC contract?
Just trying to figure out where Cog would fall in all this, given that he didn't seem to be Angela. So, it was tough for me to sort of use those same numbers as sort of the value of that character, if you will.
So what you were disagreeing with is the amount of compensation Neil was entitled to for subsequent uses of Cogliostro.
Well, the definition of who created that character more specifically.
So was it your position that Neil wasn't entitled to any additional compensation?
Well, not really. Again, I thought that again, using that he had said he had numbers that were put in there no matter what you sort of create, that he was there in issue 9, and although I changed sort of whatever, it would be a smaller number because it wasn't the same process we went through with Angela.
Did you and Neil ever agree on that number?
No.
Did you ever make payments to Neil for your uses of the Cogliostro character?
I don't know specifically.
Did you ever make payments to Neil for your uses of the medieval Spawn character?
I believe there were some payments made for that.
Was medieval Spawn in any subsequent Spawn issues after 9?
Yes, I believe so.
Do you recall approximately how many?
Maybe 2 to 4 or something.
Who came up with medieval Spawn name?
I did.
And was medieval Spawn shown, or was he made into action figures?
Right.
Fairly successful action figures?
It's a relative term, so...
Can you describe?
Well, define successful.
Within the context of the various characters you made into action figures, how did medieval Spawn come out?
He did pretty good again as a Spawn. Generally in toys, the people like the main characters, so they like Spawn.
Cogliostro had a fairly significant role in the TV series, correct?
Right.
Was Cogliostro in the movie?
Yes.
Was medieval Spawn in the movie?
No.
Was Angela in the movie?
Not as it reflected in what she was in the comic. I would say no.
Was there a character named Angela in the movie?
Not ID.
I mean, I was just trying to understand how your answer is different from saying, no, Angela was not in the movie. What was in the movie that might have been sort of like Angela?
We put a redhead in the background at a party as sort of a bit of an in-joke, if you will.
Okay, that was it?
Right.
Now, at some point in time, did you talk with anyone at DC concerning the terms of Neil's DC contract?
No, not specific to Neil's contract per se.
Okay, at some point in time, did you talk with anyone at DC about how DC Comics handled derivative characters?
Right.
Who did you talk to when?
A lady by the name of Terry Cunningham, and that would have probably been maybe 96 sometime.
Was it a phone call?
Yes.
Did you call her, or did she call you?
No, I called her.
Tell me about the conversation.
I wanted, I knew she wasn't able to speak about anybody's contract specifically, so I wouldn't put her in that position. So I wanted to sort of talk in generalities, Quote, do you give monies for derivative characters that are pre-existing? And if you do, how does any of that work? End quote. And she explained to me that DC doesn't do that. They don't. If you do medieval Superman, you are entitled to nothing. So if you do medieval Batman, you are entitled to nothing.
Were those her words with regard to medieval Superman, medieval Batman?
No. I go, quote, let me give you an example. If I did Aqua Batman, would I get anything? If I did Caveman Superman, if I did a derivative with any sort of name, Cowboy Billy Superman, would I get anything? And she was like, no, we own Superman, so we own Batman, end quote.
Did she explain any circumstances in which DC would pay creative payments for derivative characters?
If you're going to, she didn't go into it in any detail, no.
But I guess what I'm saying is, was it just a flat out, if it's a derivative of one of our characters, we don't pay anything, or was there some nuance?
I think she mentioned later that there was an extensive reworking. If somebody took a name of something and reworked it, and at that point, I believe potentially Neil Sandman actually became an example. She didn't know I was phoning on behalf of Neil that there was a character from the 40s called Sandman that it had that name, and then the character that Neil wrote had that name, but nobody would look at the two and look at their history and what they were about in the background. Nobody would make a confusion of them other than they were both sort of had the same name. And so in that case, although it was the same name of a character, as long as there was an extensive reworking of something and it appeared to be a new character, then that was they had a few examples of that within the confines of their stables.
And was this all within the same conversation?
Right.
And did you specifically ask anyone at DC about any provisions in Neil's agreement with DC with regard to derivative characters?
No, because again, I knew that people weren't supposed to talk about other people's contracts, and I wouldn't put them in that position.
With regard to DC's treatment of derivative characters generally, did you speak with anyone else at DC other than Terry Cunningham?
No. Terry was the person who did most of the contracts, so it eventually fell on her desk to finalize most of the contracts.
And did you have more than one conversation with Terry Cunningham on this subject?
Of derivative characters?
Correct.
No, that was the gist of that.
So if I understand the substance of what she told you, it's that DC would not pay for derivative characters unless there was an extensive reworking of the character. Is that correct?
Right.
Now, at some point in time, some contention arose between you and Neil concerning what Neil was being paid for the work he had done on the Spawn and Angela comics, correct?
Yes. We didn't see eye to eye on some issues, right?
Okay, when did that first come up?
I don't know. Maybe 94 or something.
In what context, do you recall?
I think it was either in the context of a toy maybe, or a foreign reprint possibly.
Did you ever have any conversations with Neil concerning, creative credit for what Neil had done or was going to do?
Only in regards to his contract and in some of the conversation we had back and forth over those years.
Okay, tell me what discussions you had with him in that regard, again with the idea of creative credit and creators' rights generally in giving credit to creators and that sort of subject.
Again, it was not necessarily for creative rights that at, quote, this is what I get at DC, end quote. So again, if you create something and somebody maybe appears subsequently in their name thing, they sometimes put a vanity credit someplace there to sort of acknowledge somebody's time on something.
Did you ever talk to Neil about this in any context other than Neil's DC contract?
Yes, we probably had ongoing conversation about that.
Okay, what type of conversations, again putting aside...
I don't recall the specifics. I know that my mind tells me that those were part of the conversations, but I don't recall specifically.
Was one of the things Image was holding itself out as a business that respected creator rights, perhaps more than the more established comic book companies?
Right.
And did you have those kinds of conversations with Neil?
Just clarify. Who are you asking the question to? Are you asking it to Todd McFarlane, the head of a toy company, the head of publishing, part owner of Image Comics, or the individual? So will you ask your question and ask me which one of those people you just asked the question to?
They are all sitting in front of me. So...
But they each have a different agenda during their day, a different task to accomplish during the day. I'm sure you do as a father and a lawyer.
Well, I guess what I do with regard to this, any conversations you had with Neil in this regard, if you could answer the question as such and say, well, this was in my capacity as.
Okay.
Such as, I think that makes a lot more sense.
Okay.
Rather than go through and ask
okay.
the same question 6 different times. Mr. Kahn, good idea.
That's fine.
Mr. Arnson, are you comfortable proceeding that way?
Yes.
And so you feel free to put a preamble in. You have to be clear. This was my capacity as blank.
Okay, that's fair.
Okay, so what discussions did you have with Neil with regard to this creator's rights issue, putting aside the same as my DC Comics issue?
As the head of Todd McFarlane Productions, who's the one requesting Neil do the artwork, that again, asking him to come on board, help me write a comic book, and if, you have any special requests that go along with that, then bring them to the forefront, and if I'm capable of delivering those, then we come to an agreement, then we'll get there.
Do you recall any special requests that he made in response to that offer?
Not at the beginning.
Okay, how about later on?
Later, he was concerned, talking to me as the head of Todd McFarlane Productions, about how some of the royalty would break down, and, how certain things would be credited would be one way or another.
And what was your response?
Quote, well, what would you like, Neil? End quote.
Okay, and did he tell you what he'd like?
Okay.
And what was your response?
Quote, well, okay, we can sort this all out, come to an agreement with all of this, and we can move forward, and I'll be happy. End quote.
Okay, and were you able to sort it out and come to an agreement on it?
I'm going to guess, because Neil is suing me today, that the answer is probably no.
Okay, what areas weren't you able to come to an agreement on?
I'd say right now, him and I probably aren't satisfied on too many of them, so we probably have a disagreement on most of it today.
And I guess really what I'm looking for are the specific subjects of disagreement that you tried to work through this in your capacity as head of Todd McFarlane Productions and weren't able to. And I'm not limiting it, I'm just following up on your answer that you gave as the head of Todd McFarlane Productions. If a different hat is appropriate, put it on and tell me you're putting it on.
Right. Can I simplify this even more?
Yes.
Can we assume that if I don't say anything... Wow, this is how it's written. If I don't say anything, it is as the head of Todd McFarlane Productions, because 99.9, if not 100% of this is as Todd McFarlane Productions.
Okay.
So unless I stipulate something different, if I talk about myself, I'm talking about myself as the person running Todd McFarlane Productions.
Okay. Because that was the position you were in the overwhelming majority of your interactions with Neil Gaiman?
Correct.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so excuse me. Could you repeat the question?
Mr. Kahn, the question had to do with the areas of disagreement between specific areas that you tried to reach agreement on but couldn't. Mr. Arnson, right.
Royalties and I think some credit lines.
Any other general areas?
Well, I think including this case here, somebody's talking about copyrights now.
First, talking about credit lines, what disagreements do you recall arising between you and Neil with regard to credit lines?
Well, I wouldn't say it was a disagreement. It was just, again, if anything goes out that I had done, can you make sure that my name is affixed to it someplace, I hate to see something and not have my name on it, so make sure that you acknowledge my existence on this stuff.
And did you dispute that?
Not really.
Okay, so to the extent that didn't happen, was it an oversight?
Yes, probably.
Do you recall any situations where you did not put or associate Neil's name with something he'd created and did so deliberately?
Well, the credit is determined by sort of the extent of the use of the character.
Right.
So again, you can have 100 characters in a book, and sort of consider all those to be equal. So again, it was the credits due were dependent upon the work that a person had done or the extent of a credit, a character being used in a book. And again, there's varying sort of definitions as to how to get each one of those.
Well, for instance, Neil wrote a scene for Spawn 26, correct?
Right.
Did you give him credit for that?
No.
Why not?
He asked me not to.
He explicitly asked you not to?
Yes.
And what was that? And was that in a phone call?
No, I think it was actually in person.
Do you recall where this meeting was?
If it was in person, it would have been at one of the Oakland comic conventions, and if not, it would have been over the phone.
And what can you recall as best you can of this conversation in which he asked you not to give him attribution for Spawn 26?
We were talking at that point about the Angela miniseries. Again, both of us were satisfied with the work and the end result of the publication of issue 9, and so Neil requested to do more work. I took that as a sign that he was satisfied, asking me to do more work. And so we talked about another project. The one that he suggested, which was obvious, was to do an Angela miniseries. So we began working on the Angela miniseries with Greg Capullo, the artist. In my capacity as a writer, in the confines of my comic book, I have a tendency to reference prior issues or foreshadow things that are coming. The trick in comics is you put an asterisk in a word balloon, and if you read comics, then you know that it goes to like sort of a footnote. You go to it and it says, see last issue, see the upcoming issue, see 10 issues ago. I mean, there's always a footnote there. I had explained to Neil that we were going to try to do something to sort of, get some of the readers from Spawn to sort of pay attention to the Angela miniseries. And so I go, sort of write a lob, if you will, an asterisk, if you will, into the miniseries. Neil requested, since she was doing a thing, well, I could write that. No. And I was like, well, that's okay. It's my book. I can write it. Don't worry about it. And he said, no. I feel part of this mini-series, and, can I write it? And you could use it if you want. And if you like it, don't worry about it. Just let me sort of do it. You don't have to pay me. You don't have to give me any credit. I don't have to do anything. I sort of have an attachment here to Angela. And I said, okay, cool. You want to do a couple of pages for me? And he wrote a couple of pages, and we put them in there again and sort of living up to his request. And he sort of didn't want to interfere with my continuity by making it look like he was putting his thumbprint on it. And those pages at the end of it, or somewhere within it, have an asterisk that say, look for an upcoming Angela miniseries that was either out on the stands just at that time or just coming out, or they were pretty close. So you were able to give a little bit of a bump, if you will.
Did you have any creative involvement in the Angela miniseries?
Not in the traditional sense that I would with Spawn.
In what sense did you have creative involvement with the Angela miniseries?
Just having conversations with Neil to see what he wanted to do, looking over the scripts, looking at the pencils, looking at the inks. I mean, I'd become essentially the editor at this point, and just looking at all the steps of the book and sort of going through the plan, if you will, conjecture, not looking at the back matter of that last issue where there are suggestions that these toys are made in sweatshops in his own book. Unbelievable. To me, that's like that tour writer stuff where it's like you're really not being a prick about like the brown M&Ms. You just want to know that people read the writer. Like whoever did that back matter piece is like, Todd doesn't read this.
And for anybody unfamiliar with what we're talking about, we did a video on the Angela miniseries, and we look at some of that back matter, and it's photos of the toy factory. So, and letter column responses from Neil Gaiman to a letter writer about those photos.
Yes.
So check out that video in our feed.
Pretty hardcore.
Turning back to the Spawn 26 again, did Neil expressly ask that you not give him credit for that?
He says, you don't have to give me credit.
Okay, as best you can recall, those were his words?
Right.
Did any issue come up with regard to credit lines in connection with the medieval Spawn or Cogliostro characters between you and Neil?
Not that I recall.
Okay. Maybe.
Maybe in a toy comic book one time.
What do you recall in that regard?
That if he wanted me to put created by or something. I don't recall if I did or didn't, but the first toy came with a comic.
Excuse me?
The first toy that I put out came with comics.
Okay.
So there was a comic book, Medieval Spawn. So I don't recall if we put any byline in there or not.
And do you recall that Neil asked for credit with that?
Right. Saying that again, you'd get this with DC, derivative characters and creative stuff. So I said, okay, I'll put it in there, yes.
And so you did?
I don't know. So we'd have to look at that comic book.
Okay, and what was the comic book?
There was, you get the action figure, and then instead of it just being cardboard you rip and then throw away in the garbage, we inserted a comic book in there.
Okay, and what was this comic book called?
I think it was just called Spawn.
Okay.
I don't know. I think that's what the cover said.
Do you ever recall any disputes arising between you and Neil associated with credit lines with regard to Cogliostro?
Not that I recall.
What dispute arose between you and Neil with regard to copyrights prior to the filing of this lawsuit?
None.
Okay, so we covered the disputes that arose between you and Neil other than those that relate to royalties?
What was the question?
Have we covered the disputes that arose between you and Neil other than the disputes that relate to royalties? And what I mean by that, we have discussed disputes that have related to royalties, but I just want to make sure that we have fully covered any other kind of disputes, and now we'll focus on the royalty disputes.
No, I think it was mostly the focus of our disagreements, unfortunately. And Jimmy, I don't see a break coming up for a little while. Maybe this is where we leave this one, because we're getting into a different round of questioning.
Sounds
that
good.
would be a good way to start the next portion, and we could probably wrap this up next episode. I'm prognosticating. Don't hold me to it, but probably.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Super cool, man. Listen. We bring up the Sandman as derivative character. He gets into it. It's inserted into the record a little bit later. Some of the Kayfabe audience, they suggested that Medieval Spawn, Cogliostro, and they suggest even Angela, all pawns in the game, to just try to get clear rights to the Miracle Man character by way of Neil Gaiman. I think it's interesting, like using these like little characters as chess pieces for a greater goal. Because who gives a fuck about Cogliostro or Cagliostro, you know?
Yeah, I agree with that part. I don't care.
But then, say you insert a little bum. Say you do Hulk Grand Design, and you insert a little character, and then that dude's in a movie. You might be salty a little bit if you don't get a little kickback. A little thank you to James Rugg at the end, man, right?
Yeah, my takeaway from all of this is just get it in writing first.
You know what my takeaway is? Sit down and make your own fucking comics.
That too.
And don't work with anybody.
Yes, that's probably the best solution. It's a quagmire, man. Every time we read one of these depositions, I just think how awful it would be to have to give these depositions.
Yeah.
To be called in and grilled this way. Even if you're not the person on trial, this would be a nightmare. In the case of the Stan Lee deposition, it's not like it was Stan Lee versus the Kirby family, even though maybe public opinion frames it that way. But just going through that process would be awful.
It's one of those, like, fucked up things, man. In those, like, LLC for Dummies books, Business for Dummies books, they say pretty clearly up front, like, if you do not get sued, you are not in real business. And in those speculator boom 1990s of comics, when millions of dollars are exchanging hands for these issues in terms of income, in terms of like what comes back after books are sold, that is real business. That's significant business. That is life-changing money to the average, like what used to be blue-collar journeymen in comics. You know what I'm saying, man? So we're in real business here. And these things do need to be spelled out. Neil Gaiman is building a bigger and bigger name every day on his own, with his own novels and the writing that he's doing. He's getting a lot of acclaim. So he's trying to sew everything up in a bun. Todd McFarlane running a nice, successful, big business. We've seen in like the Kevin Eastman, Peter Laird interviews where they have to keep money in the coffers because vultures are out in the wings. So he might be extra defensive to that stuff. This is one case that made it to court because it is two rich guys who can afford it. How many douchebags were bothering him about, hey, remember when we talked about this thing and I created Mr. Bones and blah, 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 and the Spawn cape is just a Mr. Bones cape or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Two egos, two alpha dogs, Todd's running a business. He doesn't want to be steamrolled over. You hear him talk about these inconsistencies. Can't name one, but he mentions them. So he's in a defensive position. Gaiman's in a defensive position. Unstoppable force, immovable object. We need to take this into a court of law.
It's a nightmare.
Yeah. And we'll continue that nightmare next week. Jim, you good to go?
Yeah, I am.
Kayfabers, like, follow, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the bell. We'll notify you when new vids are available. What's out there, Jimmy?
Hulk Grand Design. Tell your local comic shop to order a bunch of them. Tell them that you want copies. Pick the covers that you want. But that is coming to comic book shops in March and April. And now is the time to let your comic shop know that you want a copy of Hulk Grand Design. Celebrate 60 years of the Hulk. Marvel commissioned me to do this telling of the Hulk's history. So let your comic shop know to order big, and join me on Patreon at patreon.com/JimRugg, where you can see my original art and how I make the comics I make, including some behind-the-scenes Hulk Grand Design. March
is Cartoonist Kayfabe month in the comic shops, man. That also begins the Red Room, the Red Room Trigger Warnings series of comics that are going to be coming out on a monthly basis. Every issue is completely self-contained, though, so if you see an issue, scoop it up. You're going to get a complete story. If you dig it, grab another one. These comics are available for pre-order. Go to your comic shop, get it put on your pull list. You could go to my link tree in the description below this video and pre-order directly from the publisher, Fantagraphics. You can read these comics right now at my Patreon, patreon.com/edpiscor. $3 for the archive over there. Have over 200 pages of comics, including all of the Antisocial Network, which was last year's round of Red Room Comics. And you can support the channel that way by hitting our link trees. How else can they support the channel, Jimmy?
Subscribe to the Cartoonist Kayfabe e-newsletter. You can also find Cartoonist Kayfabe t-shirts and merchandise, and all those links are below this video.
All right, man. Give them those marching orders, and we'll be on our way.
Read more comics.
Court is out of session.